Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burgess and Stefan Bertram. Ben's been caught reading. We don't do that around here. And today we're going to go through an interesting taxonomy for assessing political ideas. So Ben, do you want to play? I've collected a long list of which maybe we can do half an hour and half at the end or something like that.
Sure.
Of desirable, viable, achievable, with various controversial ideas that I've made a list of.
Nice. I like it. Yeah. So this all comes from this book, Envisioning Real Utopias, by.
I was going to say you've got an upside down, but it's going to be mirrored anyway, so who cares?
It's not upside down, but yeah, it's. No, this is. There you go. Yeah, I think it's the mirroring. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's the Envisioning Real Utopias by Erik Olin Wright, who is the second best analytical Marxist. And, he, in the second, the essay that I wrote for today, I spent a little while at the beginning talking about Wright in general and, some of what else he was known for and up to. But in this book, as the name might suggest, he's in the business of thinking about alternatives to the status quo, and he provides this neat little schema for thinking about them. He sees what he calls emancipatory social science as in the business of both sort of critiquing and diagnosing what we have right now, and kind of trying to think through reasonable alternatives, and then to think about how we can go from where we are now to those reasonable alternatives. And the part that interested me, caught my interest to write the essay about was, when he's thinking about envisioning those alternatives, he sort of goes through three different tests. And, and it struck me that this is actually like a really useful sort of way of classifying lots of objections that people make to lots of different ideas. So, the first test is the most straightforward, is desirability. It's not upside down. Holding this right way up. First one is desirability, which is just that, it would be better than what we have right now. I mean, we can finesse that a little bit later, but I think that's maybe good enough for now. And then the second one is viability, which is to say that, the idea here intuitively is just, if we implemented the idea, it would work. And then the third one is achievability, which is to say there's some sort of realistic path of transformation that could take us from where we are to that idea. Because, if something would be nice if it happened, and it would work just fine if we could somehow implement it, but also there's no way to ever implement it. It's sort of a very limited interest.
How are we going to whom it, as Lenin said? Not quite in that accent, I imagine.
Sure.
So do you want to play the game?
All right, let's play the game. Let's do it.
Okay, some of these have to be kind of, you have to do under capitalism or under socialism, but for others, you don't have to. Okay, family abolition under capitalism, desirable.
Family abolition under capitalism sounds extremely undesirable to me.
Okay, family abolition under socialism, desirable.
Depends what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I was going to say not desirable, not because it's not desirable, but just because it's not desirable enough as a policy proposal. Like, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I think it's probably not something we should focus on regardless.
Yeah, I mean, this is, in my experience, people who talk about family abolition, and, again, I think if you're on almost any reading of that phrase, if you're taking away the sort of one source of like meaningful human connection that people have in a sea of not having it, that sounds hideously undesirable. If you, but then if you say like, okay, family abolition under socialism, what does that mean exactly? And in my experience, people who are excited about this idea tend to be a little bit squirrely about what it actually means.
Common ex-abolitionist trait.
Yes, exactly. That is in general a trait of post 1865 movements that refer to themselves as abolitionist. They're a bit squirrely about what
Right,
that
I mean, the
actually.
abolitionists back then were pretty clear on what they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like no more slave labor. We'll just have free labor. Right. That's all right. I get it. Right. But yeah, that post 1865 abolitionisms tend to be a little bit vague. And I've seen people say things like even, reforms to meet various material needs like healthcare, universally, our abolitionist policies because people no longer rely on like family for these things, which strikes me as a really impressive exercise in finding a way to rhetorically repackage an incredibly popular idea as an incredibly unpopular idea, which is impressive, I suppose. But
Yeah, like I mean, there's an idea of family abolition, which is like your dad should not be a tyranny over you for as long as he lives. Um,
sure.
but that's both, a very specific idea, but also something which is already very much dying.
Yeah, I mean that if what you mean, like there are certain respects in which what family meant in the 1940s have been abolished, and that's actually a good thing. Um, that it's just the sort of rights that parents have over children or that husbands had over wives, that like that the sort of legal abolition of those things is like just sort of more fulfilled bourgeois equality, and it's good. Um, that, but then if you're saying, well, that's not what I mean, it's like, well, what do you mean? And if you say, um, well, people shouldn't be economically dependent on their families for this, that, or the other things, like, yeah, sure, but like, there are countries with very advanced welfare states that still families, that's like a, and if ultimately what you mean is like that you're going to sort of somehow discourage, you know, monogamous households that child rear within the household, then it's, I mean, one, it's not necessarily clear to me that that's like desirable in itself, but also I think it's certainly not, if we can mix and match the categories a little bit, desirably achievable. I have a hard time seeing how that could be brought about, in ways that, I mean, it's like at that point you're talking about a kind of social engineering that like I'm not really comfortable with. That I don't really think that the point of left politics should be to tell people how to live. I think it, within reasonable limits, I think it should be to, give them the resources they need to live how they like.
Zionism, desirable?
Extremely fucking undesirable. I've actually been so I've been thinking about this one a lot in the last couple days because there's this video that's been going making the rounds. It's a TikTok video. It's not even like one of the 10,000 much more disturbing videos than this that have been going around. This is like a entirely nonviolent as far as what's going on in the video, but it's this school in Israel where the Arabic teacher at the school attended a legally sanctioned Nakba Day parade and was then suspended from the school. And despite the fact that she'd been suspended, the students still held a demonstration against her. And it's a video of the demonstration, and it's this fresh-faced children sort of doing these sing-songy chants of "May your village burn to the ground" in Hebrew, and it's all I could think as I was watching it. Well, I mean, I guess describing it now, I keep thinking about the scene, the kid singing from Cabaret, but in the like, all I could think while I watched it is like, oh, this is what the Zionist project did. It succeeded in turning Jews into Cossacks. That's nice, right? That's like, you know,
Yeah, we made ourselves into like a really shitty martial race,
yeah. I mean,
like some kind of British Empire project.
yeah, and it's really incredible that if you think back to like sort of original like sort of basic 19th 20th century sort of post-religious anti-Semitism, right? I mean, obviously the original anti-Semitism was about like Jews killing Jesus and all that stuff, but like but the modern era's version of anti-Semitism, it really revolves around this idea that Jews are bad because they're rootless cosmopolitans who don't have like the right sort of blood and soil connection to the national projects of the areas that they're in. And one way to solve that problem is to create pluralistic multi-ethnic societies where nobody needs to have a blood and soil connection to anything. A different way to solve that problem is
Make one more.
is to make one more, and that's the one we fucking went for. And so now it's like, yeah, I don't know. Now you've given us, you've given us Kippah wearing Cossacks, so good job.
Abolition of homework and bedtimes. Desirable.
Undesirable. I'll maybe even split down the middle here and say that abolition of homework, there might be a case for its desirability, but I actually think kids need bedtimes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess homework is the kind of thing where like it's not absolutely necessary. Like you can imagine an education system without it,
uh,
but you do need to tell kids to go to bed, or they'll live like 26-hour schedules where they just rotate through madness.
yeah, exactly. And then they'll be super cranky with it. Yeah, no, that's not going to work. I think I think bedtimes are necessary even in an advanced communist society.
Legalizing shoplifting.
Ah, it's an interesting one. You know, I suppose if it were viable, it might be desirable. In other words, if the proposal,
I guess in some sense that's just what communism will be.
yeah, exactly, right. So like, because it's like, look, if we're just thinking about like, we change nothing else except that like you just you you don't pay money to get products, then it's like, yeah, that sounds desirable. Not particularly viable without changing a bunch of other stuff around it, because very quickly there would be no incentive to like operate a shop for obvious reasons. So
I mean, yeah, because it's like a canteen thing, right? Where if everyone lies all the time, then no lies work.
yeah, exactly, right. That's like, it's, yeah, if people don't have to pay, then coexisting with the existing economic model, that's not gonna work. It's going to be catastrophically unviable. But yeah, since we're separating out the categories here, I suppose technically I would say desirable.
Damn, Ben is a really woke anarchist on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
Various woke ways,
This is why desirable is not the only test.
various woke ways of doing meetings.
Oh Jesus, very undesirable. I
Uh,
I, I mean, I have, like, all else aside, like any sort of strategic point you could make about why some of the stuff is counterproductive or whatever aside, um, 20 minutes of saying pronouns before the meeting starts, progressive staff,
acknowledgements.
land acknowledgements, whatever else is true of these things, and I have unrelated criticisms of many of them. But like a very bottom line thing is that these were all extremely fucking annoying ways to run meetings.
I remember in my university, my first year, they some guys had managed to organize like a big conference of like leftist people to come to the university, blah blah blah. And afterwards, they were like, okay, well, why don't we set up like a leftist group at our university to continue doing this? And for like the first meeting, like 100 people came. But then the Trotskyites, like five Trotskyites there, had insisted that we like make a constitution first before we do anything, or like have a meeting, or like just any normal stuff. And so we did that for like 2 hours, and then we did it again the next week where 30 people had come, and it took like 2 more hours, and then 15 people came the next week, and we finished it. But then at that point, it was completely pointless.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, I should also say that the sort of wokeness of all this stuff, in a certain sense, is incidental. It's a sub variation of like a more basic problem that like leftists have a lot of trouble being normal running meetings.
Yeah,
But yeah, like I think that there are, uh, I think it's also like I'm extremely suspicious of anybody who claims that
like meetings.
they like meetings. Period. Right. Like, in fact, anybody who genuinely likes meetings, I actually think should probably be on some sort of list.
Yeah,
Uh,
like suspicious tendencies towards fascist bureaucracy.
yeah, and like I don't really believe that any like it's like I've never understood. Like, I don't know. I guess if it's like the first day of class and like you can make it like kind of fun or icebreakery, it's one thing to like have people say their names and something about them or whatever. But like nobody remembers a long list of names after they've heard them go
I did all that in my Chinese. I've been going to Chinese class chat,
through.
and yeah, we did introductions, and I didn't learn. I don't know anyone's name now.
Yeah, I mean that's just not generally how people who aren't some sort of savant actually learn names, and certainly you're not going to remember any pronouns except for like anybody you were already curious about, which leads into another problem with pronoun rituals, which is the one I remember Natalie Wynn talking about several years ago, which is that she would describe the how like she could you know go to a sports bar in North Carolina and be missed and mammed all night with no problem and like no awkwardness, but go to a fucking leftist meeting and it's like her and 20 cis people and they all go around saying their pronouns, and then she could feel everybody like turning toward her
Yeah,
as
yeah.
the trans
Oh,
person.
there's going to be one that's going to say a thing, which is like is knowable.
Yeah, exactly. And and yeah, so and then you know land acknowledgements I think are an impressive combination of being at the basic level annoying, at like a second level incoherent, like on their own terms, because like I always like whenever like I'm making this point to somebody at a restaurant or something, I always like reach across and like grab their glass and be like, all right, I acknowledge that this is John's glass that I'm about to drink right now, right? Like that's if you really meant it, you would give it back, right? Like that. So it sort of doesn't make sense on its own terms. And then yeah, also it's there's an element of like what do we, actually being incredibly reactionary if you think about what the idea is, right? That is the are pieces of land like innately
Trans
attached.
historically.
Yeah, that's yeah
I mean,
that's
land back was on the list, but I skipped it because we already did a full episode on that.
yeah. So yes, I think that so all of these are good objections to all of these things, but the most important objection to them is that they make meetings last longer, which is the sort of thing that tests the commitments of my, the borders of my death penalty abolitionism.
Related, flat consensus decision making desirable.
Oh, Jesus. This is actually an interesting question because I think that, uh, I mean, I'm against it, but I think that it's sort of analytically interesting to try to sort out whether the reason I'm against it is that I think it's undesirable, or that I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
mean, I think it's the kind of thing like I was writing a bit of sci-fi earlier where everyone's like a post-human or whatever, and I think
uh,
maybe in that circumstance it's desirable and viable, but um, I think in normal human circumstances it's barely viable if you're like three friends deciding what pub to go to.
yeah, that seems right. So I think I guess I would say it's desirable. I just think that at any meaningful scale, it's not really viable. Which is why like anarchist groups are constantly kicking out dissidents, because this is like
Right, it's like the whole thing of we're going to abolish prisons and just execute people.
yeah, exactly, because
We're
like
going to get rid of democratic voting people and then just kick out the minority.
because if you actually have big persistent disagreements, consensus based decision making just flat out doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I think even when even when you don't have big enough disagreements for it not to be viable in that sense, it's certainly not. Uh, it's a little bit like I've been reading Zubov's book Collapse about the end of the Soviet Union, and a point he makes at the beginning there is that a lot of the book is about all of the things that Gorbachev messed up, and all of the sort of own goals that came along the way to the collapse. And he sort of says at the beginning, I'm obviously heavily paraphrasing, but he's like, don't get me wrong, if Soviet leadership had made better decisions in the 80s, it would have still sucked, right? Like, it just would have held on for a lot longer, right? Like, it's so like in whatever sense you might say that like Brezhnev era Soviet Union, that wasn't a particularly like viable form of economic planning or whatever, that like in the sense that it didn't really do the thing that it was supposed to do very well, but it wasn't viable in the sense that it was like teetering on the edge of collapse, wasn't unviable in that sense, right? Like I think this consensus decision making in any kind of scale is at best incredibly annoying in practice, and at worst is just incapable of navigating meaningful disagreements. So I would say, if part of what we mean by viable is it sort of works in the way that like lives up to the promise that makes it desirable, then it's not viable.
I was going to do like a parody of a land acknowledgement to acknowledge Mercutio's birthday, but then I realized I don't actually know how they go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can look up some online. Yeah, this is the traditional birthday of the Mercutio people. Yeah,
It happens this year every year.
yeah. Happy birthday, Mercutio. I hope you enjoyed Capital Class. I certainly did, and I promise not to go on for nearly as long next week. It's chapter 2 is so much shorter.
Well, eventually you have to come to this, so you can't go on eternally.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about the article more? Because if you don't, we can just do this the whole hour. I'm happy to.
I mean,
I've got a long enough list.
I'm actually really enjoying this, but sure, let's maybe take an intermission to talk about the article a bit more. So yeah, I mean, Erik Olin
I
Wright.
also I've skipped in the list the ones that you cover in the article, like reparations. So if you want to
Okay,
talk about that as an example, I won't then
sure,
do it again.
sure. So yeah, Erik Olin Wright is one of the was one of the OG analytical Marxists with like G.A. Cohen and John Romer, a few other people like that. Part of the September group, which would meet up, as the name indicates, every September to talk about their projects and argue with each other at hotels. And one of the funny things in my experience, I think a lot of people assume that analytical Marxism is the sort of name of a collection of views. And so like these guys, like they sort of assume that these guys all agreed with each other, and I think there's certainly points of influence, but I think a lot of these guys were really each other's harshest critics. And it's like, think of it more like a reading group where people are sharing their papers or something. But in any case, he, old heads will remember a couple of essays several months back about a book called Reconstructing Marxism, um, which is co-written by Erik Olin Wright along with Andrew Levine and Elliot Sober. That's the WLS we were referring to in our discussion of that. And that was written in the 90s. This is in the 2000s. And Wright is a sociologist. That's his academic training. Although he did a lot of collaboration with analytic philosophers, and I think that's certainly reflected in his style of writing and arguing. And a lot of what he did was about sort of class analysis. That's what most of his books are about, I think. I did an episode of GTAA a few years ago with Megan Day, where we went through his class locations chart, which is a sort of, he has, he says in his book Classes that the sort of classical Marxist way of thinking about classes, where you're sort of basically focusing on workers and capitalists and their opposed interests, and then a little bit about other groups that don't fit into the main two, like the lumpen proletariat or the petty bourgeoisie or whatever. He thinks that that's accurate at its appropriate level of analysis, but there are circumstances where we want to sort of zoom in for an analytical close-up, and we could sort of say much more fine-grained things about different class positions, which are, there's sort of more specific locations in the class structure. He has, depending on things like skill and bargaining power that you get from that, if you're a wage earner, or supervisory power over other employees, ownership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he has interesting things to say about how different class locations can be inhabited in what he calls contradictory ways simultaneously by the same individual at the same time. And that should definitely be the subject of a future essay. But what I'm interested in here is the emancipatory social science stuff I referred to just a little bit earlier from Envisioning Real Utopias, where he is he's interested in thinking about this sort of interdisciplinary intellectual project he calls emancipatory social science, where there are three things that you're doing, one of which is about diagnosis and critique of the existing system, another one of which is sort of postulating kind of desirable, viable, etc. alternatives, and the third is about thinking about strategies of transformation. And it's that, the critique of the existing system that he gives, right, the sort of, this is like really the normative political philosophy element of what he's up to, is about basic, social and political justice. And this is actually very, I think, Cohen influenced. We've talked about many times on this show G.A. Cohen's luck egalitarianism, or his notion of socialist equality of opportunity. And I think one way of understanding what Wright is doing here is he's sort of giving you a more carefully disambiguated version of the same idea. Mm-hmm. That it's like we might be interested in really two things, right? One is about the distribution of resources, or more broadly, he says, access to the means of achieving a flourishing life, and the other one is about distribution of power. And I think one way of thinking about how all this relate is that the sort of G.A. Cohen socialist equality of opportunity stuff is sort of a coarse-grained concept that kind of incorporates both of these things, but he's sort of sorting them into two categories, and he uses these criticize capitalism in ways that I think are straightforward and probably pretty familiar to most people who are going to watch this. But then the strategies for transformation he gets into later in the book. But the sort of middle task of emancipatory social science. And by the way, I should say, just to pause on what I said a minute ago, because I don't want to forget this. To like, when I say this is the part where he's kind of doing normative political philosophy, this is probably as good a time as any to sort of make clear something I hope people don't get mixed up about, which is that there's a lot of times on the Substack where I'm giving various people a hard time for writing about philosophy without knowing very much about it. Your Sabine Hassenfelders and Sam Harris's and all these people who make these kinds of philosophical pronouncements without reading enough of the literature to sort of make relevant distinctions and all that. And, something I plan to continue to give people a hard time about going forward. It's a fun thing to do. But I just hope it's clear that the basis of the objection isn't that, oh, these are non-philosophers spouting off about philosophy. Because I just want there to be more good philosophy being read by more people and less bad philosophy.
Right, if you're good at it, it's fine. Just don't suck.
Yeah, exactly, right? I don't care what your degree is in or if you have degrees or any of that shit, right? Like, I just care.
I mean, it's just the coincidental thing is that you just need to read stuff in a topic to know stuff about that topic and then say good things about it.
Yeah, exactly. But like, look, you are in fact allowed to read stuff without doing it for school. People do it all the time. You could have people who are in other academic departments or who, didn't go to college or whatever, who have library cards and read stuff and thus know about it and then have interesting things to say about it. And so, I think that's a distinction that's really worth lingering on for a second, right? So, and I think the reason that comes up here is that I think in that diagnosis and critique part, sociologist Erik Olin Wright is doing normative political philosophy, but he's doing it in a perfectly reasonable way, right? You don't need to have a philosophy degree to do that. So, but in any case, so that's the sort of purely normative part. Then later in the book, he gets into the strategies of transformation. Lots of interesting things to be said about that. I remember one of the earliest episodes of the What's Left of Philosophy podcast, which I imagine probably some people who tune into these are familiar with that podcast, was really about Wright on the transformation stuff. But then in between, there's the sort of envisioning alternatives part. And that's what I was talking about in this essay. Because I think that as sort of simple as they are and as like straightforward as the distinctions he's making are, I actually find them incredibly useful because I think that just making these very simple distinctions that Wright is making lets you think a lot more clearly about different kinds of objections that people make to
Right,
different.
because they're pretty obvious when you say them, but probably before reading the essay, I probably would have been able to give a less useful schema if you asked me
Exactly.
the same sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly reading it, it's like I even thought about like, oh shit, this is, there's obviously heavy overlap between this and the essay I wrote a couple months ago about, the fully automated Palestinian luxury communism essay. But it's like, oh, I wish I'd read this, right? Because even though there's a lot of overlap and I was sort of, gesturing at some of the same kinds of distinctions, this is just like a really neat way of like crisply expressing them and like, I think much more clearly, than it's easy to without it. So yeah, as simple as they are, I do find this really helpful for a variety of reasons. So, I think we can. So he gives the example, of to sort of start us off thinking about it, of universal basic income, which, by the way, is something that I think a lot of like radical writing from this era. I think this book came out in like 2007 or no 2010. Um, but a lot of like 2010s kind of radical writing, I think, got way too excited about UBI, and you know, I'm less excited about it. You know, I'm also thinking here about like Peter Frase's book Four Futures, which is like 2015 or something. Because you know, UBI is one of those things that it's like, man, a lot depends on what exactly you mean by this, and you know, that's, I think that there are versions of the idea that are worth getting much less excited about than others. But and I think that this, as a slogan, I think it's very capturable by people we don't really ideologically like on reflection.
I mean,
But
was it first a libertarian idea? Because it started off. I mean, I don't know if it was the first thing, but there was this idea of a negative income tax, right? Which basically
yeah,
was UBI.
yeah, so that's like, yeah, like Milton Friedman is like a negative income tax guy, and I'm not totally sure about the intellectual genealogy here, but I think that it's yeah, it's certainly a UBI like idea, right? And there's a yeah, there are a lot of leftists a couple decades ago seemed to be like really excited about UBI and kind of leading into, I don't know, like mid 2010s. This was like a really hot debate among internet leftists, was like UBI versus universal jobs guarantee.
I mean, it's
Uh,
a funny one because UBI is one where it would very much benefit me, but I'm not sure if it's a good policy.
yeah, yeah. Again, I think a lot depends on what version of it you're thinking of, but in any case, putting all that aside, maybe for another. I mean, so there's like Social Wealth Fund UBI, which is like the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is like the government has some investments and it like cuts everybody a little check, you know, for the return on it. And then there's like the sort of more utopian UBI, which is the idea that everybody would actually be paid a sufficient income that it would be like a viable alternative to work. And that seems to be kind of what he's thinking of here. And then I think there are things that are in between, because like, yeah, that like, you know, here's the government portfolio return on investment check. That could be like, oh, that's nice, I get $20, right? But in any case, the so I think Wright is thinking of the more expansive UBI here, and he sort of gives an example of criticisms that people might make of it, where they said, look, they can acknowledge that in many ways this is actually a very desirable idea. They just don't think it would work because you wouldn't get, I don't know, you get too many people staying home cashing their UBI checks, and too few people working to have the tax base to support a continued UBI, et cetera. And I don't think he's really taking a position one way or the other about whether that's like a correct prediction, but that's an example of a achievability. That's example, rather, sorry, of a viability based objection to a proposal for social change that isn't really about achievability. It's not about, oh, there's no way we can like kind of get a coalition together to achieve this. And it's not really about desirability. It'd be a good thing if it works. It's just a viability objection. It's just, well, it wouldn't really work. And then sort of as I kind of start to think about this in the essay, I give the example of like the Adolf Reed objection to reparations as something that's about neither desirability nor viability, but achievability. Um, so, you know, in at least certain rhetorical modes, Reed will be like, yeah, sure. I mean, if you could just kind of snap your fingers, there'd be reparations. Why not? Right? Like, that there's clearly some sense in which it's desirable, but it says, what's the sort of route in a democratic society? And, you know, the extent to which it's undemocratic isn't really going to be helpful here, because the, you know, any, you know, it's really, really hard to get any kind of social change, however moderate and reformist, that involves like large scale redistribution of wealth. That's incredibly hard to achieve under the best of circumstances, because obviously people with a lot of wealth also have a lot of political influence. And it's also existing arrangements, have a momentum of their own. And so any kind of redistribution of wealth is incredibly hard to achieve. But this one is going to be particularly hard to achieve, and not just kind of because of the sort of what the contingent political wins are of the moment, but for this much deeper structural reason, which is just kind of arithmetic. It's like, well, if the majority of society isn't going to benefit from it, then what's the scenario where we're going to get together the majority coalition, which we'd need to overcome vested interest to achieve this massive redistribution of wealth for this thing that's not going to benefit most of the people who would have to fight for it, right? That just doesn't seem particularly realistic. And, happily, right, the sort of read point here would be like, this is if the thing that to whatever extent reparations is desirable, it's because, it's because that portion of the black population that's, trapped in poverty, downstream of the long-term effects of Jim Crow and redlining and all of that stuff going back to slavery, which is certainly true as a sociological observation. And there's no sanely denying that, right? Like that's, you can, you can certainly find people on, the internet who will deny it and who have alternative, more skull measuring kinds of explanations of the distribution of poverty. But I think there's no reasonably denying that that's the causation. But if that's the, if the thing that makes reparations desirable would be that the people who are the victims of those historical processes would get economic help, but also reparations seems to be sort of in principle unachievable given population demographics, right? I mean, it's like whatever, like, yeah, I know every once in a while in some deep blue area, you'll see like, oh yeah, they agreed to form a commission to study it. It's like, yeah, okay, this, they're going to study it for a while. They're going to put out a report, and that's the last you're ever going to hear about
Wow,
it.
that would be really expensive.
Yeah, exactly. That's all it's coming to conclusion. So that's
We're going to introduce reparations and UBI, but we're not going to pay black people UBI.
that'll be the compromise. That it'll be reparations for black people and UBI for white people. Yeah, like, so it's like, look, so if it's desirable in the sense that it helps people who really need help, but it's unachievable for very basic demographic reasons, then the good news is that universalist economic programs would also help people, the same people who reparations would help, but it would help enough other people that, it would certainly disproportionately help the people who'd be helped by reparations, because those are disproportionately the people living in poverty. But it would also help enough other people that, it doesn't have the same achievability problem, right? So if you think about the sort of viability objection to UBI in the sort of more robust utopian sense of UBI, or the Reidian achievability objection to reparations, then yeah, I think you start to get a fairly good sense of how this like schema works, right? So Wright gives us a nice little flow chart with like, desirable alternatives, undesirable alternatives, and then under desirable alternatives, it's viable, not viable. In other words, would it work if we implemented it? And then under viable, there's the achievable and not achievable, and the stuff that the stuff that then we should go about fighting for is the stuff that we follow down the flow chart from desirable to desirable and viable to desirable, viable, and achievable, right?
I mean,
That's
it's good because you can just, if someone like wants to talk to you about the viability of some stupid thing, you can just use this schema to be like, hold on, I don't desire it, so I can't be asked.
yeah. Charles Ghost points out in the GTA chat, Friedman's view on UBI was just the way to dismantle welfare. Yeah, it's kind of what I was thinking of when I said it's very capturable by people who that are not ideologically congenial to us, because there's a because there's this sort of left utopian version of UBI, which is like we keep all of the other forms of social assistance, but we also have this like really generous universal financial assistance.
Sounds
But then
expensive.
it does sound expensive. Uh, and in fact, the fact that that sounds expensive is part of why this is so capturable, because there's the really inexpensive libertarian version of UBI, which is let's have some sort of universal but fairly minimal financial assistance, and we'll use that as an excuse to destroy the welfare state, the rest of the welfare state. And, you know, even like Charles Murray is a UBI guy, and he has these great calculations like, oh, see, we pay everybody a little bit of money, and look at all this that we'll save on the other end by destroying all these social programs that actually help people much more than these payments would. So, you know, I think especially, yeah, I think like decommodified social programs like universal healthcare go a lot longer, because the other thing about this, I mean, back in 2020, you know, Michael Brooks and I did all these segments about this on TMBS because Andrew Yang was running for president on a UBI platform, and of course we were Bernie people, and you know, one of the points I remember us making in one of those segments, maybe it wasn't a lot, maybe it was just a couple, but like one of the points I remember us making in one of the segments is like, look, one of the things about money is that it's used to, you know, exchange for goods and services. And the thing about prices is that people could raise them when their customers have more money, right? Like, so be careful with this, right? I mean, it's like, oh yeah, here's your $500 UBI check. By the way, rent's $400 more than it was last year. So in any,
Unfortunately, capitalism is not actually as competitive as Marx outlines.
yeah, yeah. So so I think once you kind of get some sense of how these categories work, then you can use it for the thing that's sort of particular interest to me, because, you know, this is the thing I've kind of been spending the last 5 or 6 years spending a lot of my life doing, which is thinking about and responding to various kinds of anti-socialist arguments. And so it seems to me that this sort of very simple flowchart gives you a nice way of categorizing different kinds of anti-socialist arguments, which is what I do in the last part of the essay. So you think like, okay, deontic libertarian kinds of critics of socialism are making a desirability objection. They think that socialism would be bad, right? It's not, you know, it's not desirable. It's not like, oh, if only we could get it to work, it would be great. It's that
We need rich guys.
yeah, it's good to have rich guys. That it's so yeah, there are various forms.
Who can we know who's based and who's cringe if some people aren't rich and some people aren't poor? Then
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, there is actually like a real element of that, I think, in some of these people's worldview, that it's like it's really important that like excellence gets to shine through in ways that, you
right, I mean,
know,
it's really important for them that winners are chosen in like a really obvious way, like the great upset about like participation trophies and so on.
yeah, totally, right. And this is the sort of like, yeah, so I don't really talk about this in the essay, but yeah, there is definitely a version of the desirability objection to socialism that's like, oh, too much equality sounds Harrison Bergerani. You know, we need, you know, like we need like real competition to, because that's like there's some sort of important virtue in like, you know, some people getting to really win. So I think that's definitely part of the worldview of some of these people. And then also more straightforwardly, I think various kinds of views according to which like abolishing private ownership of the means of production would be like theft from the current owners. That's a kind of desirability objection. Certainly the kind of idea that you get from a lot of deontic libertarian critics. By deontic, I just mean like not consequence based, but like principle based. You know, is that like it would have you would have too much that the only way to stop capitalism from reemerging would be to impose unacceptable limitations on people, people's economic freedom. That
There'd
you
have to
don't.
be a policeman on every corner to stop people from doing trades,
Yeah, exactly.
which is, as we know, of the essence of capitalism, doing trades.
Yes, exactly. Uh, yeah, is the we have red guards, coming out to bust up little girls' lemonade stands and all that stuff. Yeah. Um, so yes, that's the desirability objection. But then, of course, there's also a viability. There are also all sorts of viability objections to socialism. Sort of most like the most sophisticated version of this is what comes out of like the early 20th century socialist calculation debate, which is basically a bunch of concerns about how uh, like central planners would have the information that they would need to coordinate certain kinds of economic tasks, and in particular to coordinate production priorities with like fine-grained consumer needs. Um, and of course, lots of libertarians raise those concerns too. But then it seems to me that a lot of people who are sort of the people in the essay I call like cautious social democrats are people who their attitude towards socialism seems to be, yeah, sure, I can see what's desirable about it, but it's just not achievable. So why bother talking about it? Slash, maybe it's not viable, right? So um, these are people who, people I'm thinking about here are often, you know, extremely sympathetic to the kind of critique of capitalism. They're like, yeah, look, capitalism does result in all this inequality and it's very bad. Um, you know, not like, the exact account of exploitation from capital or anything like that. Like they generally don't give enough of a shit about this to find out what that is. But like in broad strokes, right? The idea that like there's a lot of bad stuff about capitalism. They're all too eager. They're totally willing to acknowledge that. And a lot of these people be like, yeah, sure, I can see that it would be nice if we could establish a viable socialism. But I think in a lot of cases they have viability concerns. I think the sort of long memory of you know, the many inefficiencies and downsides of the Soviet system, kind of lies heavy in the collective imagination of this group. And I think, again, I don't think they really often bother to look into what contemporary socialists are actually proposing enough to even see how much that critique would apply, because they just don't take it very seriously. They just think like, it's like, look, yeah, it sounds nice, but it's never going to happen, right? I mean, like, I think what really, I think they take the achievability. I think there's some viability concerns going on in the mix, but mostly they're so convinced of the achievability point, they're just, it's like, look, this is clearly, whatever crazy commie stuff you're talking about is not going to crawl up out of the dustbin of history in the way that it would need to get like a majoritarian mass movement to actually initiate new socialist experiments anyway. And anyway, even if it did, it probably wouldn't work. But the point is, like, this is never going to happen. So I think you get a range within the sort of, again, people who are willing to, like, sign on to a lot of what, to use the old style kind of second international language, you might call socialism's minimum program. The kind of reforms that socialists might want within capitalism. They're willing to sign on to a lot of that stuff. They see a lot of the downsides of capitalism, but the maximum program, actually abolishing capitalist property relations, they think is just so fanciful that it's just never been, in the 21st century in Western societies, they just don't see how that would ever happen. So I think there's a range going from, like, on the one end, like, I don't know, I remember once when I was interviewing Sam Cedar, he said, so this is a very, like, friendly and ecumenical sort of thing. Like, look, I don't think socialism is ever going to happen, but like, sure, I think like every step we get closer to that makes society better. So like the implication is like, I kind of don't mind if people talk about this stuff.
I mean,
But
that's me, but about like full automated luxury communism.
yeah, totally, right? And that's on one end, and then on the other end, I think there are a lot of people who are sort of down with social democratic reforms, but are like, I kind of wish you guys would stop talking about this shit because it's ridiculous, and it makes like the left in some broad sense sound ridiculous, and whatever, right? So that's the kind of range I think you get within this group, and then rounding off the taxonomy, it seems to me that a lot of the right, especially sort of, I don't know, like Reaganite conservatives or like Hayekian kind of pragmatic libertarians, at least if you believe their rhetoric, uh, they think kind of the opposite of what the cautious social democrats who've been talking about think. What they think is, yeah, socialism is very undesirable and also not viable, but it's totally achievable. In fact, it's way too achievable.
It's
Uh,
scary as fuck, bro.
yeah, like we're always like socialism is so achievable. We're always in danger of like sliding down a slippery slope into it.
Yeah, if we don't abolish free speech in Florida, there'll be communism tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. That so like think about like Hayek's classic book, The Road to Serfdom. Right, this is which my favorite fact about an electoral campaign of all time. Winston Churchill had printed up in mass to distribute during the was it 48 like the post World War II election in the UK, but apparently didn't convince very many voters because they Clement Attlee beat him anyway. But the idea of that gesture by Churchill is that it's like, yes, this is the road to like totalitarian communism starts with electing a labor government, and this is, or like in 1964, Ronald Reagan gave this really famous speech at the convention, the Republican Party convention that nominated Barry Goldwater, called "A Time for Choosing," where he very strongly insinuates that like if LBJ is reelected instead of Goldwater being elected, not only will we get a few more Great Society programs, which by the way didn't even really need to worry about that. It turned out that Vietnam kind of sucked the juice out of that program, but like that there'll be this slippery slope to communism. Um,
LBJ, when he killed like 1 million communists in Vietnam, was actually just doing inter-socialist competition.
yeah, exactly. And and of course they think it's very undesirable, and they think it's also not viable. Like I think if you listen to a certain kind of right winger for long enough, you would get the impression that there have been like 1,000 different like attempts at implementing qualitatively different forms of socialism that have all ended in disaster. And every time it happens, there's always a new crop of reds coming out from under the rubble to say, no, real communism has never been tried. Comrades, next time will be different. And only they, with their world-weary wisdom, understand that this next time will be no different. Anybody who's ever watched Aqua Teen Hunger Force, there's a joke they do and then a callback to it. So this time will be different. This time was no different, was it? And then and I do think there's a question about how much people who talk this way really mean it. I get the distinct sense, for example, that Jordan Peterson is probably much more worried about having to say non-standard pronouns than he is about, I don't know, Canada's big resource extraction companies being nationalized by a future Canadian socialist government. Uh, but
which is pretty funny, right? Like we can just distract them with pronoun stuff, and then we seize the commanding heights easy.
yeah. Uh, it'll be Trudeau will be giving a speech and he'll let something slip, and it'll be the scene from The Simpsons where it turns out the Soviet Union didn't dissolve. Um, I think a lot of these guys on interrogation and maybe given truth serum would admit that they aren't actually really that worried about, socialism and communism per se. They just think that like the gender neutral bathrooms or minimum wage increases or whatever that they're railing against at a given time, it sort of partake of the same fundamental evil as communism or something like that.
They're worried that libs are going to win the culture war and they want to be cool.
Which is what matters above all else. I don't know. Actually, I think some of these people might be won over by a compromised platform where we take away all of Elon Musk's money, but we also admit for the record that he's very based.
We take away all of Elon Musk's money, but we like double the interactions and all their Twitter posts.
Legally require their nephews to interact with their posts.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah.
What about universal basic interactions?
seems a bit illiberal to me, but yeah, I think
no, but you can just get bots to do it, so it's fine.
Okay, in that case, I might be able to get on board that you have bots, impersonating people's nephews to admit that they were owned and that they're stupid libtards. That might actually be a worthwhile form of mental health intervention for these people. But yeah, I think that and those sort of end the essay on this kind of optimistic note, which is just like, I think right now the attitude of the second group I'm talking about, the cautious social democrats, seems much more grounded in reality. That it's really hard to imagine, the political ground shifting to the point where we could actually achieve a socialist transformation of society, like from where we're standing in 2024. That's very difficult to imagine in any sort of vivid and detailed way. I suppose you can, you can just kind of, it helps a little bit if you do, what's that stupid fucking book, Half Earth Socialism, the thing at the beginning where they're sort of like, they just kind of announce, they're sort of trying to give you like a vision of the world, and they're sort of announce all the big developments that have happened and be like, man, I want you to go back and tell me more about how this could have happened. But that's in any case, I think that it's like, it's very hard to imagine a series of events from here to there right now. I think that it's not, and I think this does raise an interesting question about achievability, and it's why I think it's important to at least have a in principle achievability, right? Like that there's a sort of coherent strategy that makes sense on a certain level that would take you from where we are now to what you want. And I think socialism does have that because it's in the interests of the vast majority of the population, and so that does suggest something about the strategy that could take you from here to there. But like that's also a fairly minimal constraint as opposed to a sort of more robust notion of achievability. Because look, I mean, if we're asking what's achievable in the next 5 minutes, then the answer is probably fucking nothing. I mean, this is like, it's like, it's like we can't like, I don't know, get in like getting Canadian style healthcare in the US isn't achievable. That's expanding Medicare in Canada for a universal prescription drug benefit, isn't achievable. It's like it's
all, doesn't have a majority in Congress right now.
Yeah. Cutting off aid to Israel is unachievable. This is like, you just sort of stop doing politics if you're a leftist. But I think that, I think I think that if you're actually interested in, envisioning real utopias, right, like a sort of more utopian sense of future social change, I think any kind of achievability constraint you're interested in has to be a bit more generous than that, right? Like, not what's achievable, given who's in power right now, and not even given what's achievable given anybody who's likely to be in power in, the sort of foreseeable next few elections or whatever. But like, is it in principle possible to imagine, given unpredictable political developments changing the terrain, but like certain basic facts about what kind of society we live in and who lives there remaining the same, is it in principle possible to imagine this stuff being achieved? And it's like, yeah, that's a test that I think a lot of this stuff can pass. And, and look, history tends to surprise people who live through it. Even the primary example used to ground pessimism about socialism could actually be repurposed, as Erik Olin Wright does here, for the other direction. It's like, look, in 1987, who would have said that the Soviet Union wouldn't exist in 5 years? That would sound insane. And I think so. Yeah, I think, look, maybe maybe the conservatives are
You
onto
never
something.
know.
Like, and in a way, I'm sort of perversely comforted by their paranoia about the achievability of socialism. It's like at the end of the essay, I, say, my favorite, not anti-Semitic joke, but joke about anti-Semitism, which is the two old Jewish guys sitting on the park bench in like the 1930s or whatever, and one of them's reading like the local like Yiddish press, and the other one's reading the fascist newspaper, and the first guy sees what the second guy's reading. He's like, "What's wrong with you? How can you read that?" And he's like, "Look, when I read your paper, all I see is bad news. It depresses me. When I read this paper, I find out that we control Hollywood, we control the banks, we run everything. It cheers me up." Right. So it's like, yeah, I am cheered by the paranoia of the right about the achievability of socialism, and long term, fuck knows.
How long do you want to spend returning to the list?
Oh, let's do at least a few more just to round it out.
Computerized economic planning. Viable.
Ooh,
Sorry,
okay.
desirable.
Yes, definitely desirable. Viable is a more interesting question.
Degrowth.
Extremely undesirable.
Yes. MAGA communism.
I mean, as much as I want to say undesirable, I think honesty compels me to admit that I would have to know what they were actually like, what they actually wanted to know whether it was desirable. I mean, if
If
it's
it's
just
if it's distracting people with pronouns while you seize the commanding heights, then sure. But I don't think
sure,
it's ever going to turn out that way.
yeah, I mean, because I even did a debate with one of the leading leading lights of MAGA communism, and I still don't really know what MAGA communism is. I think it's, I kind of get this, like, sometimes it seems to just mean like, convincing people who are really into Trump to be communists by like,
Even though that's the word they like the least in the world.
yeah, it's all confusing. I mean, look, if you could,
It's like if you do, it's like MAGA Satanism.
I'm sure that exists. There's no way that that doesn't exist. That there isn't someone out there somewhere with the with like a bunch of black face paint and a red Trump hat, explaining that they worship Satan and his servant Donald Trump. That must be a combination of existence. Yes, I am going to need to earn another pew. Well, because Haas already took my old one, so yeah.
You can have mine when I get it.
All right, fair enough. Good deal.
The next three are more tactics than policies, but they're funny anyway. Building a compound like Black Hammer style.
Uh, well, if desirable means would I want to live in it, then no.
Yeah, definitely not. Entryism.
I mean, okay.
It's
I
hard. You
mean,
can't really do entryism in the US because you don't actually have parties.
yeah, not really, right? Because like yeah, because the sort of classic entryism is you're like a member of a you become like a member of the Labor Party or whatever, and you go to Labor Party meetings and recruit there and all that stuff, and which to be fair, I mean, it was actually, I mean, at one time, um, certainly a more successful strategy than most. I mean, militant tendency like ran Liverpool, but that
It didn't end very well.
sure. I mean, it's I mean, look, if we're going to evaluate left tactics by whether they led to ultimate victory, I've got terrible news for you. But yeah, I think yeah, it doesn't really apply in the U.S., but and I think all the interesting questions about entryism are actually viability questions, like whether this could work. Um, but if we're
Right. I
just
mean, if the question is it desirable to take over your leading centre left party and get all their money and property and stuff? I guess the answer is yeah, of course.
yeah, 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 right.
Protracted People's War.
Well, that doesn't sound very fun to me. I think undesirable.
I think it depends on your time and place.
I mean, I think that look, it might be. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but I think because really these are categories they're supposed to be, you know, I
No,
think are
these are
best
policy ideas.
are
I mean, they
best
are
suited.
kind of, but like,
Yeah, are best suited to evaluating like end states, right? Like the like a sort of
right. The end state of protracted people's war is winning, which,
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
guess it's
Sure,
desirable.
that's desirable. If the cause that you're fighting the protracted people's war for is a good one, then winning is desirable. But so it's like, yeah, the categories don't really apply here. But if I suppose if we are going to play the game, then it's like, look, I would, having won wars is desirable, but being in them is very undesirable.
True. High density housing YIMBYism.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. I mean, sure. Like, look, if the end state that we're imagining is that lots of people are living in very affordable housing, but it's all kind of packed together, then I guess it's like more desirable than what we have right now.
Where they're
Uh,
packed together on the street.
yeah, exactly. There's definitely more desirable than what we have right now. So if that's all we mean by desirable, then sure. Again, viable, I think, is a much more interesting question. I suspect that the actual um, reasons for lack of affordable housing are go deeper and are less easily solvable by a bit of local zoning deregulation
Yeah, I
than
mean, I think if it continues under the control of capitalist businesses, then they're going to really try and make it expensive, right? Well, they're going to try and cheapen it in one hand and make it expensive on the other, as you generally do.
yeah, right. And I think Seth Ackerman, I think, wrote something interesting about this for Jacobin last year, where it's called like the problem with the economics, where he's sort of questioning whether this is all going to work quite the way it's supposed to here. I mean, I think that if nothing else, like I'm not necessarily against like if the question is like if you seize control of local government but nothing else, and I'm not really against like issuing permits for a whole bunch of new private residential housing. I'm just skeptical that that's going to do everything that the YIMBY enthusiasts think it'll do. And I think that there are good reasons to think that at the very least that should be combined with things like rent control, which a lot of YIMBYs hate, but I think is pretty important, and And also just like, look, I mean, ultimately, if we want lots more housing that people can live in, that like we don't actually just have to try to see how we can trick the existing market into building it. Like we can, like if we're imagining a scenario where we've taken over some levels of government, we can just build some housing ourselves.
Yeah. Death to America and Anglo genocide.
I'm against it.
Juche.
Oh dear God. I mean, yeah, this is really hard to tangle out. Living in North Korea sounds pretty undesirable to me, but like, if we're sort of really taking this seriously and say like, okay, so Juche, if we mean the sort of economic self-reliance that North Korea says that it aspires to, and we're really being careful about separating desirability from viability, then I guess, I mean, like,
I mean,
yeah,
if there's any country that could do Juche, then surely it's the United States.
yeah, I think so. Which is actually the really funny thing when people say, I mean, not that I do think, to be clear, that like completely cutting the U.S. off of the world market would be way more of a catastrophe than it might be tempting to think. But that said, it would be way less of a catastrophe than it would be for most countries if they're
I
cut
mean,
off.
you can kind of combine the two propositions, right? Like Anglo genocide, not in a physical sense, but just by kind of physically separating Americans from the rest of the world, and then Americans can do Juche.
There you go. Yeah, you build the giant wall or the dome. You put a big dome over the continental United States. I think Alaska and Hawaii will just have to go free so the rest of the world isn't bothered by it. So we just do Juche. Yeah, I wouldn't particularly like that because I would like to be able to travel to not America. But yeah, I mean, again, I think as much of a catastrophe as that would be economically for the U.S., way less of a catastrophe than it would be for most countries to have it happen to us, which is really the funny thing about the way that so many right wingers will do this. Like, yeah, this or that social democratic, program might work great in Norway, but
Right.
you couldn't
Yeah,
possibly.
it'll work in some like shithole place which couldn't like feed itself and like is only sustained through the extraction of some resource which is destroying the planet. But in America, where we have everything, no way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that the fact that the U.S. Is so much bigger than Sweden or Norway means that we're actually less dependent on global markets, and it would actually be easier to do things that would anger capital implemented here. So that seems exactly backwards to me. But yeah, I am generally pretty down on genocidal anti-ethno nationalism. I think that that's bad. So I don't know. I think that for all the ways in which we might be annoying, I'm inclined to think that white people should be allowed to continue to exist.
Police unions.
Yeah. Um, this is a really good question, actually. I think that actually existing police unions obviously play a really reactionary role in a lot of contexts, and that's bad. Um, but I do tend to think that people overstate their importance in explaining a lot of what's bad
Right. I mean,
about.
in lots of countries, police unions are banned, and I'm sure those
Yeah,
countries still suck and have like bad police.
yeah. I tend to think that the things that are bad about policing are just as bad in all of the countries that don't have police unions because they haven't been able to organize one or they're banned or whatnot.
But
I
I
mean,
think it's definitely not something leftists should like try and organize, which I think counts it as not desirable.
yeah, yeah. I mean, look, if I have I would, I mean, I think it's a very mixed bag. I think that policeman as like one of the only jobs where I actually want to make it much easier to fire people. You know, but like I also think one thing to throw in if you're really thinking about the sort of desirability of non-unionized police is that I think that, you know, I used to live in Mexico. I'm actually about to go back for a couple months over the summer, and um, it's you know, I'm not doing any in-person teaching until the fall, so you know, figure might as well live a little cheaper by the beach for a little bit. But uh, but the experience of living in Mexico has really brought home to me that having police be really poorly paid has some negative consequences that I think some leftists haven't thought enough about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's also about relevance of like kind of like how does the social structure work? Because you could imagine like in a sufficiently kind of wealthy country or whatever, like Danish police paid like Danish minimum wage, it'd be fine. But yeah, and especially I think in the United States, it wouldn't be a very good idea.
Yeah, I think if you have a lot of, I think if you have a lot of cops being paid Walmart wages while still being, you know,
they
given,
have like they have tanks and minimum wage.
yeah, yeah, I could see that going very wrong.
Um,
I'll just leave it there.
one big union.
Yeah, that sounds desirable.
Oh, really?
I mean, whether or not it's viable, I mean, it's like I don't know. Give me the case for its undesirability.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess just kind of structurally, what's the point of it? Like, could you have an organ? Like, for instance, if we go back to like the computerized planning thing, like
Sure.
either that one big union is very kind of like centralized, in which case probably it can't respond to the concerns of workers in of its various parts in a way which is particularly useful, or it's very decentralized, in which case how is it really one big union? Is it not just an association between unions that we already have?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think what's really I guess part of what's attractive about one big union talk is really basically just the sort of original ideal of like industrial unionism as opposed to craft unionism, that you have like that everyone, you know, like it's certainly very desirable that everybody who works in a place is a member of the same union, and that often doesn't exist right now, and that's bad. um, I think that beyond that, um, it's it's obviously good for different groups of workers to support each other and honor each other's picket lines and do sympathy strikes. Illegal in this stupid country, but you know, etc. And so, to the extent that's what people are gesturing at when they say one big union, that all sounds good. Uh, but like, is what you're describing, yeah, if it's decentralized enough to like really be functional, although this also sort of veers into viability concerns, then is how different is one big union in principle from just
Like a
a
trade union congress, which we have in the
yeah,
UK.
right. Yeah. That's a fair question.
Um, voting.
Voting? Uh,
I guess this is tactics again instead of
yeah,
desirability.
this is kind of tactic.
Yeah, because if it's taken as desirability, then I'm asking about democracy, which is
Yeah. Democracy is good.
yeah,
I guess we could make it a policy thing and do like the Australian like universal mandatory vote in, but
right. Yeah, I mean that shit sucks.
I don't know that I like that, but suppose depending on how enforcement works.
It's funny because people always say like, oh, if we had compulsory voting, the left would inevitably win. But then in Australia, they somehow managed to be like exactly the same as every other Anglophone country, where it's like 50-50 Labour and Conservative, one win the next.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the way a lot of American leftists think that like the two-party system in the US is like the problem in a way that's like, look, it's certainly a problem. It's not good. It's very bad. But like but
But yeah, you can have like 27 parties like the Netherlands have. It'll be a shithole country.
yeah, exactly. Like it's like, yeah, I don't know, man. Like the sort of neoliberal turn happened in all these countries that actually already had like labor or social democratic parties that were independent of like the center left liberal party, and it still happened, right? Like it seems like there are bigger things going on here than how people organize political parties. But like
Uh,
I think Americans generally have a really bad habit of acting as if we already live under the dome and forgetting that the other countries exist.
DEI.
Yeah, yeah, undesirable. I think like civil rights, like anti-discrimination laws, are desirable, but like, and you need a certain amount of bureaucracy to enforce those. But like anything that goes beyond that, I think, is pretty undesirable.
Did you see the thing where California had a referendum to abolish not being able to discriminate people on the basis of race, gender, whatever, so they could do positive discrimination?
Yeah, I mean that's just, I don't know. It's
It seems setting yourself up for some fucking terrors in the future.
I mean it's all like I mean my problem, like affirmative action is one of these phrases that means a lot of different things, and I think some of them are way better or worse than others. But and sometimes it just means like we made an effort to sort of reach out to and make sure that we were interviewing candidates who might, not.
I was actually a DEI hire on TIR.
Sure, yeah. Uh, that's fine, but I'm very suspicious. Like, I think that the affirmative action, at least the way it works right now, um, is often kind of a weird bait and switch, because the sort of fundamental reason for the demographic discrepancies in like which groups end up going to college, which groups end up getting some certain sorts of professional or managerial jobs after college, etc., is all kind of downstream of the distribution of income, right? That people that the groups that end up doing these things less are the groups where the portion of people living in poverty is greater, and all that stuff. And the problem with actually existing affirmative action is that it's often done in ways that don't actually benefit the people who you sort of think that you're benefiting when you say that. That's like that, like, oh, like if you say, oh, we're going to make sure that we like, admit more black people to Harvard, you're thinking it's like, oh, like you're going to admit more black people who like grew up in bad circumstances and don't have very many opportunities, but Harvard doesn't want to fucking admit them, right? That's the last group that Harvard wants, right? Like they want people whose families they can have long-term financial relationships with. And so like, Burt Cooper wrote a good article about this. They end up doing things like admitting all of these like children of Nigerian oil executives so they can like claim the racial proportionality, even though there are like very few American black people, or they end
Yeah, I
up.
mean, I went to a university like that. Like our commencement speech, my graduation was given by the Nigerian economics minister.
uh,
That's what I
uh,
get from the Paul side degree.
that's funny. Sid Sid Nanda, I accidentally banned from GTAA, and now I can't figure it out. I went into the part of YouTube. I was trying to ban somebody else, and I accidentally banned him. I went into the part in YouTube, the back end where it's like it shows you the list of banned users. I couldn't find anybody that says Sid Nanda. I tried unbanning somebody who looked like they were in about the right order in the list. I thought maybe that was an alternative name or something. So, in all seriousness, DM me, and we'll see if we can figure it out, because I feel awful about it. But but yeah, I think it's just like, and honestly, by the way, if you really wanted to address the more fundamental problem, you could just do affirmative action that was linked to parents' income level. But of course, that's the exactly the opposite of what all these universities want.
Last two. I skipped a lot because I thought you'd talk about them for ages. But last two. MMT.
Well, I mean, MMT, strictly speaking, is a descriptive theory, right? I mean, this is a
I
claim of,
guess like you'd want your socialist party when governing a capitalist economy to behave as if MMT is true.
I mean, it seems like all the interesting questions there are going to be about viability, because if it's just like, you know, we spend more money, um, we get to spend more money doing socially positive things, then sure, that's desirable. I mean, I think there are interesting questions about viability. And I also think there are interesting questions about achievability. In other words, that are like, I actually think MMT style framing might have political disadvantages that people don't.
Yeah, I think MMT just kind of seems kooky, but I think the idea that states now can literally magic money out of thin air
Yeah.
and don't really do anything with this. Like they don't act as if fiat is like possibly they do that. They don't act like they can do that because they need to maintain some kind of mystique around fiat currency. But really, they don't. I don't think they act like currency is fiat.
Yeah. That's a good point. Like, and I also think a lot of MMT people, I mean, it's not subject to know tremendous amount about it. And, I'm sure there's like some angry viewer who's super into MMT is like, yeah, fuck right, you don't. I can tell, right? Like, the but I get the impression from talking to MMT people that some of them, like a lot of them, will sort of acknowledge that there are in fact limits. I mean, they all say there are limits. There's like resource limits and all that stuff, but like they might even acknowledge that there are some like shorter term pragmatic limits to the ability of governments to just print money, because you run into inflation problems and all this stuff, and they say, well, that's why you need to. That's like, even though they'll sort of deny that taxes fund government spending, they'll sort of say, well, you still need taxes for these various other purposes, and like one of them is about inflation control, and I just have to say, um, quite apart from all the descriptive questions you could ask about this, and if I mean, to the extent that, like, money represents actual control over resources, um, I don't even. I have a hard time seeing how is not in fact true, at least in some sense, that taxes fund spending, but in it, like, just as a pragmatic political thing, if we're going to think about it like achievability concerns, saying we need to raise taxes in order to fund giving everybody health care strikes me as a much more effective populist pitch than we need to raise taxes because it's going to have this like wonky technical benefit.
Yeah, we
That,
need to like destroy money or something.
yeah, exactly. Like, I have a much easier time imagining selling people on
we
it
need
in the
to,
first
we need
place.
to tax people so we can steal their money off them, so we can print more to give them.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, Busing
Busing?
schools.
Yeah. I mean, I'm generally friendly to this sort of given existing alternatives, but also I think that it's sort of, if we're kind of imagining like how we would ultimately want all this to work, um, it's kind of not really like people having to spend a lot of time on the school bus because they're going to school in some other neighborhood doesn't actually seem like what we.
I think people don't think about how bad it is how early we make children wake up in the morning, and how the main problem with busing is not the fact of whatever else of like Tarquin has to go to school with some working class black kid.
Uh,
The fact that the working class black kid is to wake up really early in the morning.
yeah, that part's not great, right? I mean, it might be like given existing setups, then it's that might be like better on balance, but like ultimately, presumably, what we want is to have like much more integrated housing and to have
Like it's only ever a stopgap, right? If you
yeah,
ended up
exactly.
permanently locked in busing, then like that's bizarre.
Yeah, something has gone really wrong if that's the case. Like, because ultimately, what you want is for you know people to you want the housing to be integrated, and you want there to be like good, well-funded schools all over the place, so that there'll be like one close to where everybody lives. And if you're just sort of like, yeah, if it's like if you're doing 30 years of busing or something like that, right, then it's like, yeah, some other stuff has gone really wrong. So that's definitely a limit on its desirability. And then of course there's also various kinds of achievability concerns and whatever. But like, I think that like if it's I mean, if I'm in an area where like somehow there was going to be a like, you know, there's a really good school that's like, you know, tilt higher income and is almost all white, and there's like a really bad school that's the other way around. And the question is whether there's like a ballot initiative to do busing or something. I would vote for that, but like I don't. Yeah, like you said, it's always at best a stopgap.
Do you know the ones I skipped over? Drug legalization, sex work legalization, veganism, nuclear disarmament, agricultural collectivization, democratic centralism, freedom of religion, and Christian socialism.
Good lord. Okay, just to pick a couple of those. Uh, Nuclear disarmament is extremely desirable. All of the interesting questions are about viability. That you sort of have to figure out how to make sure nobody, uh, you know,
Doesn't.
nobody, nobody doesn't, and thus has thus has one way assured destruction. And yeah, veganism, I think is I think if there was like really good food that involved no animal suffering that was easily available everywhere, that sounds desirable to me. For that to be viable, um, I mean, well, one, even like they're actually getting way better at fake meat, but it's just not nearly. I mean, one, they're not all the way there, and two, it's just not nearly widely distributed enough, right? That they like, your corner carne asada place is not going to have the impossible carne asada.
I
Uh,
imagined vegetarianism when I had to go gluten free because I was like, fuck, I'm not going to be able to eat fucking anything.
yeah. The other thing that you would need for universal veganism to be viable is you need to get way better at vegan dairy products, because all the ones that exist right now are like inedible. Let's see, what was it? Agricultural collectivization. Yeah, I yes to all end stream. Yeah. I don't even remember all of them. Freedom of religion desirable for sure. Um, the Christian socialism. Oh yeah, here we go. Sorry, I got the written list now. Uh, yeah, I mean Christian socialism. I guess like if it's socialism plus everybody's a Christian, I guess it's more desirable than what we have now. But I would prefer socialism plus not everybody has to be a Christian. A democratic centralism seems more tactical. Uh, agricultural collectivization. Yeah, I mean, again, I think all the interesting questions are viability based, right? I mean, this is
Especially even relating to universal veganism.
true. Yeah, there are real viability concerns when you put those two together. Yeah.
Presumably, universal veganism would massively decrease the amount of non-human animals.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean,
it's
unless we're just so rich that we're like, you just have the pastures, man.
yeah, maybe. I mean, it's also not totally clear to me that it's that bad an outcome.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I don't necessarily see it so either. But
like because it's like lots of pigs suffering is bad. Fewer pigs being born doesn't necessarily strike me as that morally significant an issue. But
because that's what Singer thinks, right? Or thought, right?
yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, I mean, agricultural just yeah, again, viability worries, approach with caution given historical precedents. But yeah, I mean,
Watch out, Kulaks, I'm coming.
ultimately, I want everything to, within reason, to be collectivized. See, sex work legalization, I think undesirable, and this at least I mean, I really hate that term sex work because it jams together a bunch of things that I think really should be separated.
Right. I mean, it's insane, right? That we there's like an area of work allegedly where people going from people who do something very similar to what we're doing right now
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
to people who like do something very similar to like what street drug dealers do.
yeah, yeah. I mean, again, I think street level prostitution and like making like sexual content for the internet are just radically different things. But look, I think that I have a pretty old school socialist attitude on this, which is that like I always think whenever I hear that sex work is work, that like it's like yeah, my child labor is labor, it's the sub minimum wage jobs are jobs, like
Yeah, getting
I
your fingers ripped off at the loom factory is labor.
yeah, yeah, lots of things are labor. That's a different question from whether they should be legal. And I'm very wary. I mean, whatever you think the right policy fix is exactly, or who should be prosecuted and how when.
I
I'm
mean, you
very
hear people say like, "Oh, under communism, it'll be legalized." It'll be like, "We won't be working, mate.
yeah,
Well, we're gonna have like
yeah. If you're
the last jobs anyone has will be fucking virgins."
yeah, if you're really imagining sort of capital F, capital C, full communism, then nobody's exchanging sex for money because nobody's exchanging anything for money. If you're but even if you're imagining a sort of like short-term viable kind of socialism, it's like, look, I think whatever else is true about this, and again, I'm very suspicious that like, legalizing it leads to anything good, but like, um, whatever else is true about this, I do have the like kind of old school socialist view about this that Marx certainly had, etc. That it's an incredibly disturbing symptom of the level of inequality that we have that this is a thing that exists. Um, that that it's just not like I don't. I think that it would, you know, without even having to be made illegal. I mean, like I think it would cease to exist in a more equal society just because nobody would be desperate enough to do that. Again, I'm not talking about you can have your fucking OnlyFans. I don't care about that, right? I mean, I'm not talking about
You
like
can findom as many people as you want on the internet until we abolish money.
yeah, I'm talking about like street level prostitution, right? Like that's a thing that I think is a symptom of extreme economic desperation, and it's a sign that something has gone horribly wrong with the society if it exists at all. And I think that there is a legitimate question about it's like, look, if people part of the problem here is that if a job exists legally, then you're going to get people who are pushed into doing it because it's the job they can find. And it's, this is, I just think there is a distinction between, like, I think commodifying the most sort of intimate parts of human interaction is bad, actually, and that and I do in fact think that there's a difference between, like, I don't know, like being a janitor, right? That's something that I've done in the past, right? You know, pre-grad school when I had to have real jobs, that's it's like, yeah, look, cleaning toilets sucks. I do think that there's a distinction between that and like how, and like, you know, sucking dicks of like people that, you would not otherwise choose to. I do think one of
And
those.
also, like, I mean, janitors are essential, right? Um,
Yeah.
and like sex
Yeah.
work isn't.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I'm very sex work negative. Drug legalization. I mean, I think there might be a sense in which it's desirable. I'm not.
Because
I
obviously, it's kind of like the levels of desirability to then inference with like the levels of viability, right? Because the best situation around heroin is when no one recreationally uses heroin.
Yeah,
But how is that viable compared to legalizing it, where some people will certainly, in that case, use heroin recreationally?
yeah. I mean, it is. There are really hard questions here because I think that there is.
Which is why I gave you an out to stop the stream and not talk about it, but you wanted to, so let's go.
Yeah. I guess this is the last one. So yeah, there are really hard questions here. Because yeah, this one does strike me as a bit more complicated. Um, I think, like, I'm pretty okay, and like, I think even like Portugal. I think people think Portugal is like way more libertarian than it is about this. I think even Portugal does quite a bit to sort of semi-coercively push addicts into treatment. Is my understanding,
Yeah.
and that's like good. I think that I'm really not. I'm really not that. I'm
We're
really
not,
not.
we're not drug use respecters.
Yeah, I'm not really a drug use respecter. I think that
Did
the
you see anarchists complaining that they like banned drugs in the Palestine encampments?
fucking awesome. Yeah, no. What's really important here is that I can't like leave the tent to get high.
The real problem in this camp is that we're banned from bringing things that would 100% justify a police raid.
Yeah, exactly. Good God. Yeah, no, I'm not particularly drug use respecter, and I'm very wary of like, look, there are lots of things that are just sort of like personal life things that I'm happy to be like very libertarian about. But I think one of the problems with extending that too energetically into this domain is that it's kind of the nature of serious substance abuse to that you kind of have much less ability to regulate your own behavior. I mean, that's kind of the
I
nature
mean,
of
it's like
the
the better a drug is, the worse it is, right?
yeah.
Like
Uh,
you can legalize weed because weed kind of sucks. Like it doesn't really
yeah.
do anything apart from like make you a moron.
Yeah, I mean, which is pleasant sometimes, but yeah, I mean, I think that my experience of heroin addicts and what I've always heard of, I think they are deeply unlikely to seek help on their own initiative. And I don't actually just, I mean, I think it's kind of dystopian the way that the society that I exist in is increasingly handles that problem by saying, well, just go fuck off and sleep in the park. Um, and so yeah, I am in favor of, in one way or another, trying to push people into rehab, whatever exactly that looks like on a policy level. I will acknowledge that there are some difficult trade-offs here. That um, you know that prohibition does lead to does make these drugs much more dangerous. For example, um, I also think that I also think that there's a real worry here. Um, okay, actually, let me say this differently. I think that one thing that people are often way too quick to do when they make drug legalization arguments is is to say, oh well, anybody who wants to can find it anyway. It's like, yeah, not really,
Not
right?
really. Like, no, like if it was sold in dispensaries, no, like a lot of people are prevented from buying drugs because it's kind of like embarrassing and awkward, and like you have to go to shitty places to do it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
like
right,
drug dealers are incredibly unreliable.
yeah,
Like you'll text a man to buy like addictive drugs, and he'll reply like 12 hours later, being like, "Oh, I was asleep."
yeah,
That,
yeah.
that must have
I,
saved lives.
I recall having the thought many times in the mid 2000s that that I was really hoping that weed would be legalized soon for precisely that reason. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the higher the opportunity cost is, the fewer people who will actually use something. So the germ of truth, and anybody who wants to can use it anyways. That anybody who's sufficiently committed to will, but that's a very different question, right? I mean, it's the same thing as like all of the if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Like, yeah, I mean, sure, sufficiently
But
dedicated
how
outlaws.
many of them?
How many of them, right? Like,
Because in Britain it's like 150 guys.
exactly. Like,
I don't know. This is probably something bizarre in to Americans, but like British drug gangs in places like Manchester and Liverpool will have like one gun between like 10 different gangs, which they use on like a shared rota basis.
that's hilarious, actually. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure here in the land of opportunity, we can arm every member of the gang. But yeah, I think that so I think people are way too quick and glib with those kinds of arguments, and um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what drug policy should be. I think the parts I'm sure about are that I do want way more government spending on addiction counseling and rehabilitation, and I am pretty comfortable with the legal system pushing people into taking advantage of those things, because if you're suffering from serious addiction, you really don't have a lot of free will, and you're not going to take the initiative yourself. And I'm willing to be a bit unlibertarian about that, kind of the same way that I think that like I'm pretty comfortable with the power of the state being used to like catch somebody who tries to jump off a building to commit suicide. Um, but I also think that treating it primarily as a criminal issue rather than a medical issue has been a huge disaster. And I think that, generally speaking, locking people in prison is sort of really bad for solving the problem. And that I think that the real thing. I mean, look, I guess I'll just end this on the most boringly predictable thing I could possibly say, given who I am and what I think, which is just that like whatever exactly drug policy should be going forward. I mean, again, I'm not a big fan of like that war on drugs kind of framework, but I also am a little uncomfortable with like kind of going all the way to as libertarian a place on drugs as many contemporary leftists seem to be willing to do. Whatever the exact right policy approach is, I think the biggest thing is just like you got to change the underlying conditions. That um, there's a reason, and I mean, again, I think there's a lot of pretty unserious commentary on this in the left. Like these are people that I like. Um, yeah, that's okay. I'm willing to. I think you heard me say
Yeah,
that I was.
I mean, we are. We just we let's coerce them.
Yeah, I'm kind of okay with coercing them. I'm not saying, oh, this is like addiction counseling as an alternative to coercion. I'm saying it's like, yeah, let's do a little coercion, a little gentle coercion, and get people the help they need. But yeah, I think that like, I don't know. So to pick an example of people I like and agree with about many topics, right? So Crystal Ball and Kyle Kalinske, who, again, I like them. I was at their wedding, but they were interviewing Anna Kasparian on their show a little while ago, and she said something about how it actually is helpful to have some social stigma to help people, be encouraged to get the help they need. And I think at that point they were having technical problems, but they said the next question they wanted to ask her is, well, should you have social stigma with alcohol? And it just strikes me as like not a great analogy to heroin. That obviously alcohol abuse is a real thing, but also there are vast numbers of people who have healthy and reasonable uh, amounts of alcohol use, and I really don't know anybody who has a healthy, reasonable relationship to heroin. Um, so yeah, I just, I think wherever you come down on the policy level, and I have some mixed feelings about that. The real thing is like, yeah, what are the conditions that cause all of this drug abuse in the first place? That there's a reason why the opioid epidemic coincided with deindustrialization, and afflicted the areas of the country where that was worse. There's like a classic study on uh, like so there's that classic, like the thing about like the rats will take some, I don't know if it was heroin or cocaine or whatever it was, but they'll like get addicted to it and they'll take it in preference to food. And
Yeah, yeah.
then there's a point where uh, somebody had the bright idea of redoing the study, so you actually gave them bigger cages and let them play with each other and stuff, and before you know it, they were actually taking the food. I think there's a pretty obvious analogy going on here, that like there are generally people who have serious substance abuse problems. There are other things going on in their lives that led to that, and that's not all about economics. Obviously, there are plenty of
Did you see
rich.
the rat experiment where they were trying to force the rats to drive little cars around little cages, around little mazes, and were worried about like whether they would actually do it. But it turns out they fucking loved it so much. Like they got like they just they drove they love to drive little cars.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think if you changed nothing else about how American society worked, except now you could like go down to the CVS and buy heroin, I think that would be really bad and lead to a lot of really bad consequences. That doesn't necessarily mean that I love the like super harsh criminalized approach either. I suspect that there's, the least bad course for now is probably in between somewhere, but I also think at the end of the day, like, yeah, there's a reason. It's like, I don't remember what the stat is, but there's some totally ridiculous portion of American soldiers in Vietnam who were addicted to heroin by the time they left. And then, amazingly enough, it seems like from what we could tell, most of them stopped when they came back home and weren't in this horrible situation where people were trying to kill them all the time. And it just seems like there's a lesson there. Give us bigger, nicer rat enclosures, and like all this other stuff we're talking about is how to manage the symptoms. And don't get me wrong, it's important to manage symptoms. Symptoms can kill you, but I think the more important thing is to take a step back from the dilemmas that arise when you think hard about how to manage the symptoms, and to think a little bit more about what the root problem is.
Wisdom. What are you writing next week, Ben? What have you already
Oh,
written or whatever?
yeah, I have. I have actually. So I believe, here we go. I'll put it in the. So put it in the chat. So since Andy already made the artwork for it, you can if you want to share it. So this is here we go. So it's going to be called Fascism and Conceptual Analysis, and it's about the debate that has been breaking out with renewed force lately about whether Trumpism is fascism, Orbanism is fascism, what is fascism anyway, and sort of taking it
I
from a
feel like
little
this is a very, very small step to eventually getting to is Marxism, Gnosticism.
bit. Yeah, fair enough. So I think that and I'm kind of trying to approach this from a little bit of a different. Thank you, Crucio, and happy birthday again.
We went for 2 hours just for you.
Yeah,
I don't know
exactly.
if you wanted that.
And yeah, I mean, I think that it's, and I sort of try to approach this from a little bit different angle. Be like, I don't understand what the rules of this debate are, because normally I think when we're doing conceptual analysis, we're trying to figure out like what some common word we all use means, the way we do it, the sort of rules of the game, or we think about clear examples of things that count. We try to abstract from that some idea, some sort of definition. We apply it to a bunch of cases, see if we can come up with counterexamples, things that meet the definition, but seem like they clearly, aren't fascism, or things that clearly are fascism but don't meet the definition. But it doesn't seem to me that people are actually following those rules in this debate. That they're sort of going about in a really strange way that makes me think that when people think they're arguing about whether Trump was fascism, Orbanism was fascism, whatever, they're actually arguing about other things. And it seems to me that there must be a less stupid way of having that other debate, that we can just like maybe not route it through this weird debate about definitions and just debate the thing itself.
Yes. I mean, it's part of a general tendency, which I might write something about someday, where all positive words are just debased to mean good, all negative words are debased to mean bad.
Yeah, right. Because I think like so much of the time, what people are really arguing about is like, oh, is like Trump really bad, or like should you suck it up and vote for Biden, or is Trump like qualitatively worse in some way than earlier Republicans, or whatever. It's like these are
Is Bidenism fascism?
yeah, go nuts. So yeah, it's a very yeah. I just think like these were all interesting questions in themselves, but I think it's much better to just argue about them directly, and not route it through this weird argument about whether. And I also just think that that's sort of, I don't know, like I kind of hate that we can't, like so many people don't seem to be able to get it up to oppose bad things that exist right now unless they can first convince themselves that this is somehow
It's the apocalypse, actually.
a manifestation of the interwar European bad thing. Like I think other things, you know, basically, my hot take at the end of the rainbow here is that some things are not fascism, but are nonetheless very bad. Uh, but,
I'm not sure if I've got any insane takes about fascism. I have to come up with them over the next week.
yeah, fair enough. And also, Mercutio, to your last chat, chapter 2 is actually going to be a breeze after chapter 1. Remember, in the preface to the first edition, Marx actually says that the most difficult part of the whole chapter, the most difficult part of the whole book, is chapter 1, section 3 about the value form. That you've already read that, and chapter 2 is much more straightforward. It's only 9 pages long. Don't fear chapter 2. Just read it. You'll be good, and then we'll have a nice discussion about it next Sunday. If anybody wants to, anybody who's watching didn't sign up in time for the first class, I will be posting the recording of that. For everybody who signed up, so if you want to join for chapter 2, it's a nice gentle time to join because it's such a short chapter, so it's easier to catch up on your reading. But yeah, otherwise, see you next week.
Don't fear capital.